Thank you for tuning in. We were in the parable of the sower this morning at Lakewoods Drive in Mark chapter 4, and we were looking at this phenomenon that Jesus points out here, the idea of having ears to listen, and the fact that most people didn't have them. We have ears, obviously, but not to listen. What does that mean exactly? How does that affect the way that we interact with the gospel or refuse to interact with the gospel? And of course, the parable of the sower talks about the wayside soil and the rocky soil and the thorny soil and then the good soil also. And we need to make sure that we're in the one. And really more in the context of the parable, we need to understand when we take the gospel to other people, we need to be able to assess the situation, to have a certain level of expectation. Not that we get cynical or jaded about such things, but that we realize that it takes more than simply having two ears or even one ear to listen to the gospel. You need to have the right attitude of heart. And I wanted to follow up on that a little bit by getting somewhat more specific. And just for fun, we're going to flip over to Matthew's version of this story in Matthew chapter 13 and look at this breakdown of the communication process. And I'm going to offer you a few very specific things that interfere with the hearing process. And there could probably be others as well, but we'll just discuss three of them here today, and then the lesson will be yours. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse number 10, after having told the parable, then the disciples came up and asked him, "Why are you speaking to them in parables?" He answered, "Because the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you to know, but it has not been given to them. For whoever has, more will be given to him, and he will have more than enough. But whoever does not have, even what he has, will be taken away from him. That is why I speak to them in parables, because looking they do not see, and hearing they do not listen or understand." And then he quotes from Isaiah chapter 6, noting that the same phenomenon existed in Isaiah's day. And the difference between us and them is pretty obvious, I think. Here, the us, or he's not being given to you, that is, we, the listeners of Jesus' explanation, we are different because we've come for an explanation. And Jesus is always inclined to give an explanation of what he has to say to the people who ask. He is not going to seek out people who spurn him, who reject him, and give them an explanation, because they're going to do the same thing with his explanation as they did with his sermon in the first place. And so the idea of having and then getting more is a very important and very interesting concept for us here. At least it is for me, and perhaps for you as well. The idea that if you get in the habit of coming to the Lord, finding truth, finding wisdom, you're going to find even more wisdom. If you have enough wisdom to search for wisdom, you're going to get more wisdom. This is actually not just a philosophical jaunt on our part, but this is actually Bible truth. We see that a lot in the Proverbs, etc., that knowing wisdom begins with a search for wisdom. And Jesus assures us that if we ask, we will receive. If we seek, we will find. If we knock, we will have the door opened up to us. That's what this searching process is all about. But if you don't have ears to listen, you're not going to engage in this process, or at least you're not going to engage in it for very long. Either, in the case of the wayside soil, you're going to reject it immediately. This is not what I want, I know, and going to throw it away and move on. Or else it's going to fall on the rocky soil, where the soil might show some interest in a general sense in what's going on. In fact, a great deal of promise, perhaps. The seed is described as shooting up quickly and very quickly growing up into this plant, maybe even faster than some other kinds of soils that it's planted in. But eventually that lack of root, that lack of depth is going to kill the plant off. It's not going to be able to survive. And there's that fall into this weedy soil or thorny soil, and the text says that no mature fruit is going to be brought forth there, or it was choked out in Matthew's version here in Matthew chapter 13. The idea that it goes well, and perhaps even to the point of producing a certain amount of fruit, but it doesn't do very well in this situation. And that's talking about those that are trying to give themselves to Jesus, but they're also giving themselves to other things, and they can't focus enough. Well, I want to get more specific a little bit about that and say what that actually looks like in the modern day. The first problem I'd like to suggest here is that Jesus is going to rob them of what they love, instead of empowering them in the search for what they love. And this is a conflict that we see over and over again. Eventually, people will figure out sometimes despite their best efforts. They're going to find out that Jesus does not want for them the things that they want for themselves. Jesus has been used as a tool, as an excuse for getting all kinds of things in political arenas or in economic arenas or in personal arenas, whatever it happens to be. There's some way that I can utilize some corruption of the gospel to get me where I want to be in the physical space. And the more you study Jesus, the more you realize that is inconsistent. That may be, in fact, completely contraindicated to what Jesus is trying to do. He is actually trying to stop you from doing the thing that you want to do. And that is not something that we enjoy very much. That is, we don't like hearing the word no. At least I certainly don't. And most of the people I know in my culture, we like to pursue our own things and be allowed to do whatever we want to do. And the entire idea of submitting to the kingship, the lordship of Jesus, implies that his way is going to have to come first. And that means at some point we're going to have to choose. We're going to have to choose whether to do Jesus things or our things. And we're not suggesting here that you have to get this absolutely perfect every single time, but there does have to be a level of commitment that pushes us in the right direction, and that causes us to seek his things. And we'll get better at it presumably as we go, but that initial intention of seeking Jesus things instead of our own things is a very difficult phenomenon for us to grasp, and it's very easy, in fact, for us to reject it. We'll reject it as long as we can and still consider ourselves Christians and still consider Jesus Lord. And eventually, when it becomes obvious that Jesus is condemning our behavior, maybe the preacher won't leave us alone or whatever, then we'll reject Jesus, because ultimately we're going to do what we want to do. Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, in verse number 19 and 20, this is a very problematic passage for a lot of people who want to think that Jesus is just all about patting them in the head and saying, he's going to accept me just as I am and things of that nature. The text says here in Matthew 5, verse 19, "Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven." Now, you might kind of twist Jesus' words in verse 19 and think that, maybe least in the kingdom of heaven is not that bad. But he's more clear in the text in verse number 20. You don't get in. He says, you're not going to be a partaker of the kingdom unless you exceed the righteousness of these other ones. And these ones who are noted for their attempts at righteousness, certainly their claims to righteousness. And I don't think that he's talking here simply about having a bigger stack of good deeds and a smaller stack of bad deeds than these other people had. I don't know how you go about measuring something like that. I don't think that is what Jesus is trying to say. Rather, what he's trying to talk about is a commitment to following the law, a commitment to following after what Jesus is telling us to do, and a commitment to turning away from the things that he has told us not to do. Maybe we think about the rich young ruler in this context. We talked about him recently also. The idea of being compelled by Jesus to turn away from his riches, to give everything he has to the poor and follow after Jesus. Well, in a sense, that's two different ways of saying the same kind of thing. Following after Jesus is, you're going to have to give up the things that you have if you want to follow after me. And he says similar things to us in other contexts, maybe less literal than it was then. But the idea of surrendering everything to Jesus, giving up our lives, he calls it in Luke chapter 9. We surrender our life so that we can save our life, so that we can have this other life. We exchange this physical life for this spiritual life. And these are metaphorical to a large degree. Obviously, Jesus isn't saying that you have to die physically so that you can go to heaven. That's not his point. You do have to die before you go to heaven, but that's not his point. The idea is that Jesus has to come first always. And the idea that he will allow us to do whatever we feel like doing and then keep us anyway, then accept us anyway, that's contrary to everything that the gospel is talking about. I might say similarly along these lines, the idea of improvement. I've come to Jesus and I'm okay the way I am. I really feel like I am certainly doing a whole lot better than these other people here. Maybe it'll be good enough for me to just be baptized. I'll accept that, and to come to church services and and not cheat on my spouse and things like that. Well, that's fine as far as that goes. We certainly hope that we're willing to do things like that. But the idea of growth, the idea of personal growth, building a life for Jesus is foreign to a lot of people. A lot of people who attend an awful lot of church services, of people who would never dream of cheating on their spouse, find themselves, I don't want to say incapable, because they're not incapable, but unwilling to really make any kind of effort to improve. This is the idea behind the parable of the wise builder in Matthew chapter 7 at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks about the one who builds on his words and the one who builds on the sand instead, which is someplace else, basically. It's hard to build a life where Jesus tells you to build it. And this is, the entire metaphor depends on the idea of not being so much focused on one-time accomplishments, but rather a lifetime, that you're accomplishing something over a long period of time. Like a preacher would preach in a location and build some kind of temple with whatever material might be available. Paul uses that analogy in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We are building a temple to the Lord in and of ourselves. And if we are truly made over into the image of Jesus Christ, if Jesus really has been crucified, we've crucified ourselves with Jesus. It's no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me, Galatians 2, verse 20. If that is the case, then we're going to make a protracted, and increasing effort to grow in our faith, to develop more and more of the fruit of the Spirit, to purge from our lives more and more of the works of the flesh. That's a process, and it's an ongoing process. And if we're unwilling to engage in this process, that kind of sounds like the rocky soil there. The idea that I'm Jesus guy, supposedly, but not if it really means putting in the effort. And, I know from firsthand experience how difficult, how challenging, how annoying it is to get the rocks out of your garden space, to free up the seed to produce as it should. It's annoying, it's obnoxious, but you need a real root system in Jesus if you're going to accomplish anything for him in your life. And so we continue to build, we continue to grow, we continue to develop these skills. As long as we are not yet quite loving our neighbor as ourselves, or loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, then we have work to do. And we should not quit until we have reach that goal. And of course, we're not going to reach that goal this side of eternity. So with Jesus' help, with this commitment on our part, we can make all that work. I want to talk about delayed gratification also, because this is another thing that really flies in the face of modern philosophy here. There is this tendency to think that Jesus is going to give me what I want. And I may be patient enough to wait a few years for it, and give myself a great deal of credit and give him a great deal of grief, quite frankly, for not making it quicker. But I'll stick it out. I realize that Job suffers, but at the end of the day, Job gets what he's entitled to and more. And that, as long as God's willing to do that for me, then that'll be okay. I'm willing to put up with a little bit for a while. But I need to know that it's going to be restored to me when the time comes. Well, it will in a spiritual sense. It will in an eternal sense. There's nothing that you're going to give up that you're not going to get back in spades. That's what Jesus says in any number of contexts. This sacrifice is worth it. It may not be worth it in carnal terms right here, right now. And by right here, right now, I mean in our physical lifetimes. You may not see any kind of return on your investment in a physical arena in the first year, the first 5 years, the first 20 years, or ever, as far as that goes. If you think that Jesus is some kind of objective, some kind of tool to use for more money, or more comfort, or more friends, or more likes on your TikTok account, or whatever it happens to be, that's not the way that it works. And in fact, it's not even playing in Jesus' ball field. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, again, the Sermon on the Mount, in verse 18 and following, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break through and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He's saying here that these carnal objectives, although maybe perhaps necessary after a fashion, as we're living here on planet Earth for the time being. This has nothing to do with your walk with Christ, has nothing to do with your home in heaven, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with your standing before God. If I am right with God, that means he's going to give me a lot of stuff. And just congratulate ourselves for not demanding it right here, right now. That's not it at all. That is not the plan. Jesus says you seek heavenly things. Whatever he gives you here on this earth, obviously God is the giver of all good and perfect gifts. James 1 talks about that. And that's a wonderful thing, and we're grateful for these things. And we certainly should express our gratitude. Continue to pray for more of them. That's perfectly fine. Give us this day our daily bread, etc. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking that the presence of these short-term objectives of ours, however important they may seem to us to be in the moment, that is not what we're here for. We are here for spiritual things. And that's really the crux of the problem that Jesus deals with his would-be followers in his life, that he continues to deal with now. The frustrations that we get when we're trying to evangelize the gospel to the people of the world here, who would love to have a day's worth of loaves and fishes. That'd be great, but if we want to stick around and listen to Jesus preach for a while, that may be too tough for us. I think we got other things to do. We'll go find our loaves and fishes someplace else. That is a very common phenomenon in the modern day as well as in Jesus' day. Feeling good right now. We can twist the gospel to make Jesus out to be that if we want to. Many people have over the years. We need to fight that urge because Jesus clearly had opportunity to minister to people in the flesh. And he did minister to people in the flesh after a fashion. He healed people's illnesses, etc. But that was never the main objective. And when the healing and the support and the feeding people and such got in the way of the main objective, Jesus left. There is an ongoing, a very consistent pattern of behavior on Jesus' part. We need to have that same kind of process too, because this is not about how we preach the gospel. This is about the nature of the gospel itself. The gospel will appeal to spiritual people. It will not appeal to other people. And it doesn't matter so much what kind of packaging you put on it, etc. It's going to be what it is, the way Jesus has given it, the way that Jesus has expressed it, the pros and cons, if you will, if you want to put it that way. It's always going to be the plan of God. And it's always going to be the case that there is wayside soil, and there's thorny soil, and there's rocky soil. And we should anticipate getting that kind of reaction. And if we do get that kind of reaction, it's not because the gospel is broken or outdated or even poorly presented on our part. It's because the souls of human beings have always been inclined to push back against the things of Jesus. And we could go on with all kinds of different explanations, different rationalizations that people will use. But that's what it basically boils down to. It basically boils down to people who don't want what Jesus is offering, or at least they don't want it badly enough. They don't want it more than they want these other things. They would rather depart and be miserable about missing out on the kingdom of heaven, as the rich young ruler did, than stay put and do what Jesus has told them to do and receive the reward that Jesus is offering to them. So let's hope and pray and continue to study and continue to build our faith so that we will be content with these things, so that our garden will be full of good and honest and committed soil, ready to give the gospel a place in our heart, ready to receive the gospel that's implanted, that's able to save our souls, James writes about. That is the blessing of the gospel and the assurance that when we do that, it will grow in us and it will produce fruit manyfold, sometimes 100, sometimes 60, sometimes 30-fold. It doesn't develop the same way with every person, obviously, and that's a lesson in and of itself. But it does develop, and we can find contentment, we can find joy, we can find purpose in that, knowing that Jesus is using us for his purposes, and to God be the glory in all of these things. So let's hope and pray that we find fertile soil for the gospel, certainly in our own hearts and in the hearts of others, as we continue to serve Jesus in our little corner of his vineyard while we wait for greater things. Thank you very much for following along. I hope this is a blessing to you, and God bless.